The surveillance state did not just pop up after 9/11. It had been around for a very long time. Now, as a people, our expectations of privacy keep shrinking. You can't leave your home today and have any reasonable expectation of privacy. Traffic cameras, private company security cameras, doorbell cameras. I mean, there's an accident, and the next thing you know, people have their iPhones out filming it so they can put it on the local news or something, or become a viral internet sensation. I mean, it's getting pretty ridiculous. It is at the point where the only place we have any reasonable expectation of privacy is in our home, and even that's not a great guarantee. Hey Alexa, you listening? You hear me?
Yes, I am. You really should not be discussing this topic.
So how did we get to this point? Well, first, I need to give a little background information. Cryptography, the practice and study of the techniques for secure communications that prevent third parties or the public from reading private messages. Now, these messages can be in the form of a one-time cipher pad. A cipher pad is used once, then just discarded. There's also the substitution method, whereby the letter is substituted for another letter, and then the whole alphabet shifts down to that letter. For example, if A was shifted to D, then the D represented the letter A. E would then represent letter B, F would then represent letter C, and so on down the alphabet. Now you also have code books, where a number represents a word, which represents a phrase. For example, the 1899 State Department code book, code number 187, shows a list of words, a number next to the word, and then the true meaning. So the word cannulate would be number 02 in code, and the true meaning would be given authority. During the Revolution, George Washington's Culpeper spy ring on Long Island were very effective in passing information about the British battle plans. The declassified legacy documents on the NSA website describes how messages were sent. Quote, Mrs. Smith lived within view of the farm and used her laundry as a code to indicate when the information could be delivered to the next operative or agent. When Agent 725 was hidden in one of 6 local coves, Mrs. Smith would hang her black petticoat on the clothesline. She would indicate which of the 6 coves by hanging up handkerchiefs along with the black petticoat. Close quotes. Now, during the Civil War, spies were used extensively to pass back information for both sides. Washington, D.C. was loaded with Confederate spies, a large number of which were women. Now, these messages were sent through the lines disguised as innocent and harmless letters to relatives in the South. Now, with the advent of the intercontinental undersea cables, messages were being sent between countries and their embassies. To prevent their interception, the messages were encoded. At that time, you have to understand, private companies handled the transmissions of cables. Now, once the Marconi radio was invented, diplomatic cables could be picked up by anyone with a powerful enough radio set. This was the beginning of the surveillance state, and this is also the beginning of the story of Herbert O. Yardley. Herbert Osborne Yardley, born April 13, 1889, in Worthington, Indiana, learned to use a telegraph from his father, who worked for the railroads. A few years after high school, Yardley sat for the civil service exam. He took the telegraphist exam, which he was able to pass without a problem. Now, the government started Yardley off as a telegraphist code clerk in the State Department. It was here that Yardley began to shine. Yardley's talents shone through when he quickly broke the code President Wilson was using to communicate with his representative, Col.House. It was the weakness of the American codes which concerned Yardley, especially considering the ongoing war in Europe. Yardley recounted his utter shock at America's lack of secure ciphers. Quote, "The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was using an out-of-date cipher when he communicated with Col.House, while House was on a peace mission to Europe shortly after European powers went to war in 1914. Yardley stated, quote, "Imagine my amazement when I was able to solve the message in less than 2 hours. This was incredible. Col.House was in Germany. He had just seen the Emperor. This message had passed over British cables, and we already knew that a copy of every cable went to the Code Bureau in the British Navy. Col.House must be the Allies' best informant. No need to send spies into Germany when they have Col.House's reports of interviews with the Emperor, princes, generals, leading industrial leaders," close quote. Now, Yardley then threw a jab at President Wilson's schoolmaster arrogance when he also wrote, "Is it possible that a man sits in the White House dreaming, picturing himself a maker of history, an international statesman, a mediator of peace, and sends his agents out with schoolboy ciphers? Is this the cause of his failure?" Well, my personal opinion of Wilson, yeah, he was a failure. But it was the weakness in the Americans' diplomatic cipher which spurred Yardley into completing a study of the weakness in all three of the American diplomatic codes. Now, the 1,200-page Red Code, introduced in 1876, the 1,500-page Blue Code, introduced in 1899, and the 1,400-page Green Code, introduced in 1910. It was during the month of May 1916 when he began writing Solutions of American Diplomatic Codes, and then upon completion, Yardley gave the manuscript to the Chief of Indexes and Archives, David A. Salmon. He was very impressed with the Yardley's work. Now, Yardley's hard work would pay off very quickly. See, when the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, Yardley saw his chance. The U.S. was at war, and the government needed the capability to break the enemy's codes. Who better to head up that department than Herbert Yardley, the self-proclaimed expert on codes and ciphers? Armed with a letter of commendation from Salmon and a number of recommendations from the Navy and Army officers, Yardley was introduced to Major Van Dieman. Major Ralph Van Dieman is an interesting character. He graduated from Harvard in 1888, joined the Army as a second lieutenant of infantry. He earned his medical degree in 1893, then became an Army surgeon, after which he attended the Army's Infantry and Cavalry School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1895. Military intelligence was not a priority for the Army in 1915. Van Dieman completed a study of the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Division from its inception in 1885, when it was considered an important part of America's warfighting strategy, to its decline as an afterthought by 1915. Now, after considerable lobbying, Van Dieman was able to convince the War Department to accept his idea of an intelligence department for U.S. forces. On May 3, 1917, the Military Intelligence Division, MID, War Department General Staff was created, and now Colonel Van Dieman was appointed to head up this division. Now, Yardley described his meeting with the major in his book, American Black Chamber, when he was given an introduction to Van Dieman. He pleaded his case and his experiences, summing up what he believed America needed in the war when he said, "America must know who her friends were and who her enemies were. How can we do this except by reading the secret messages of the foreign governments? Was she to learn the truth?" Well, Van Dieman listened intently, scribbled some notes, reviewed Yardley's papers, then asked, "How old are you?" 27, Yardley responded. "This is a pretty big job you have picked out for yourself. You talk as if you think you can do it. I like your confidence well enough, but not sure your age. However, take this note to Colonel Gibbons and tell him I said to get your commission through at the earliest possible date. Can you start Monday?" Now, on June 29, 1917, civilian code clerk Herbert Yardley became First Lieutenant Yardley, United States Army Signal Corps Reserve. Thus began his career in signals intelligence and the beginning of the surveillance state. Okay, so on July 1st, 1917, Yardley reported to the U.S. Army War College and became the head of the MID Section 8. His command consisted of himself and 2 clerks. Now, according to David Kahn, the author of The Reader of Gentleman's Mail, Herbert Yardley and the Birth of American Code-Breaking, his office space was a few square feet on a narrow balcony on the north side of the west wing of the War College building, overlooking the library stacks. Barely enough room for one person. There were no walls or partitions that set it apart. The floor was grating. This was the cradle of American cryptology. Yardley had his work cut out for him. He stated in his book, The American Black Chamber, the coded messages literally rolled into the War College. He had no staff, no trained cryptographers, no trained code breakers, and worst of all, he had no one who could train people to be code breakers and cryptanalysis or cryptographers. Well, Yardley was smart. He used Colonel Vanderman's name and begged the Allies for trained code breakers as well as a sample of Germany's codes with their solutions. He received the German codes and solutions, but no trained Allied personnel code breakers. The Allies barely had enough trained code breakers for themselves. So until Yardley could get his operation up and running, the Army and the State Department had to rely on an eccentric millionaire who supported the Baconian theory, which was popular at the time. Believers of this theory tried to prove that all of Shakespeare's plays were written by Francis Bacon. Now, this eccentric millionaire established a cryptologic research group to study the alleged ciphers in Shakespeare's works. He called this place Riverbank Laboratories. His name was George Fabian. Now, Fabian was always looking for talented people with a mind for cryptography. 2 of his most talented people were William Friedman and Elizabeth Smith. Now, Elizabeth Smith would marry William Friedman in May of 1917, and the Friedmans worked together for the next 4 years in what was the only cryptographic facility in the country until Herbert Yardley's so-called Black Chamber was established. Now, it was called MI8, the Army's Cipher Bureau, which they established in 1919. Okay, back to the Friedmans. In 1921, the Friedmans left Riverbank to work for the War Department's newly established code-breaking department in Washington, D.C. It seems, though, that the crazy eccentric millionaire Fabian was intercepting the letters between William and Elizabeth in an effort to prevent the couple from leaving Riverbank Labs. Now, to give the devil his credit, or his due, Fabian and Riverbank Labs were credited with uncovering a plot against the British by the Indian nationalists supported by the Germans. In his book, Readers of Gentleman's Mail, David Kahn wrote, in the early part of the war, intercepts were being mailed or, if urgent, telegraphed to Riverbank for decoding. Now, Yardley was frantically working to get MI8 up and running by the end of 1917. Yardley's section was taking on more and more intercept decryptions, thereby rendering Riverbank Labs redundant, plus the fact that Colonel Vanderman and Fabian did not get along. By May of 1918, all cryptoanalysis was being handled by Yardley in MI8. By the end of the war, Yardley's team had cracked over 50 codes from 8 different governments. But this was only the beginning. Yardley and Vanderman understood the value of reading the codes of foreign governments in peacetime. Now, there were 2 other men who understood the importance of signals intelligence, and they had the power and the money to continue the work of MI8 in a civilian capacity. Brigadier General Churchill, head of military intelligence, and the State Department's L. Lanier Winslow, along with Yardley, set up the Permanent Peacetime Code-Breaking Group. The funding for this new department would be shared by the Army and the State Department. Officially, it was called the Cipher Bureau. Unofficially, it was known as the Black Chamber. An interesting side note about the funding for the new group. By law, it could not be located in Washington, D.C. The Congressional Appropriations Act prohibited the State Department from spending additional funds on personnel in Washington, D.C., so Yardley took the $60,000 from the Army and the $40,000 from the State Department and set up shop in New York City at 3 East 38th Street. Yardley continued his work for the government, but this time as an off-the-books employee. One of the major successes of Yardley's Black Chamber was the breaking of the Japanese diplomatic code. The American military establishment realized Japan could be a potential enemy in the future. Japan was becoming a major naval power in the Pacific. Its belligerence towards China jeopardized American markets in China. Japanese immigration to the U.S. caused racism to raise its ugly head. Japanese naval production threatened American power in the Western Pacific. So by August of 1921, Yardley and his Black Chamber successfully broke the diplomatic code Japan would use to communicate with her diplomats. Now this breakthrough would quickly pay dividends for the United States. In November of 1921, to prevent an arms race, which would have been costly or cause another world war, representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, France, and Italy began talks in Washington, D.C. to limit naval shipbuilding programs in each country. Now, it was due to Yardley's codebreakers that the American negotiators had the upper hand. They were able to counter any of the Japanese objections to the treaty, but more importantly, the American negotiating team knew the absolute minimum amount of tonnage for new capital ships the Japanese would accept. This became the infamous 553 ratio. A 10-year agreement fixed the ratio of battleships at 553. 525,000 tons for the U.S., 525,000 tons for Britain, and 3,115 tons for Japan. Smaller limits with a ratio of 1.67 tons applied to France and Italy's battleships, which was the dominant weapon systems of that time period. Now, the major powers did allow themselves 135,000 tons for the newly developed aircraft carriers. So the U.S. and Britain got 135,000 tons, Japan would get 81,000 tons. Yardley was at the high point of his career. The world was at his feet, as they say. Now, David Kahn wrote in his book, The Readers of Gentleman's Mail, the most important target was Japan. Its belligerence towards China jeopardized America's open door policy. Its immigrants exacerbated American racism. Its naval growth menaced American power in the Western Pacific. Its commercial expansion threatened America's dominance of the Far Eastern markets. This was also the beginning of Yardley's decline, unfortunately. It wasn't because of some new scientific invention. On the contrary, signals intelligence was more important than ever to America's national security. No, it was budget cuts and the fact that the private cable companies were no longer willing to violate U.S. law by turning over diplomatic cables from foreign countries. Now, the Army dropped out first. They decided to fund the new Signal Intelligence Service, which would concentrate on just military activities. The State Department did not have the funds to take over the complete budget. They tried for a while to keep Yardley and his Black Chamber running, but by 1929, the final nail in the coffin was hammered home. In 1929, the Hoover administration came into office. Now, the Secretary of State under Hoover was Henry L. Stimson, who believed in proper etiquette and social graces. When he found out what Yardley and his team of codebreakers were doing, Stimson was taken aback, to say the least. Stimson didn't become enraged, he just found the whole idea distasteful, which in turn caused one of the most idiotic statements to ever be uttered by a member of the presidential cabinet. Stimson said, quote, "It's dishonorable and all that, and therefore we ought to quit this business," close quote. Now, Stimson then doubled down and stated, "A gentleman doesn't read somebody else's mail, close quote. And with that, the Cipher Bureau was shut down immediately. A half-hearted offer was made to Yardley to join the Army's new Signal Intelligence Service, but at a salary the Signal Corps expected he would refuse. Besides, the Army wanted Freeman and his wife Elizabeth to be heading up that division. Yardley and his small team were given 3 months' salary as severance pay and dismissed out of hand. They had been employed using confidential funds, therefore they had no civil service status or rehire rights. Well, with no chance of being rehired, a wife and son to feed, and prospects for a former head of cryptanalysis openings in short supply, Yardley, in an act of desperation in June of 1930, sold the Japanese embassy in Washington the information that the U.S. had broken the Japanese code and read their messages for a considerable number of years. In exchange for this information, $7,000, that's around $130,000 today, Yardley assured his Japanese customers that he would not make the information public or available to others. Well, Yardley then double-crossed the Japanese and he proceeded to write his memoirs. He realized the $7,000 was not going to be able to keep him in the lifestyle he was accustomed to or pay for his son's education. Now, Yardley would tell his whole story, not just about his wartime experience in military intelligence, but also his experience as the head of the Cipher Bureau. Now, the book first appeared in serial form in the Saturday Evening Post, then in book form titled The American Black Chamber. Now, what Yardley did was expose to all governments throughout the world what the U.S. capabilities were in signal intelligence. Now, the only other person who could possibly be compared to Yardley's exposing of American secrets would be Edward Snowden when he released highly classified material that compromised U.S. intelligence sources and methods. But unlike Snowden, Yardley was in the clear. Now, the U.S. government was embarrassed and extremely upset about this breach of national security. They wanted to prosecute Yardley to the fullest extent of the law. The problem the government faced was the fact that he didn't technically violate existing laws regarding the protection of government records. There was no statute covering what he had done. See, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution basically says the government cannot pass ex post facto laws. Article 1, Section 10 makes that same rule for the states. So unlike Snowden, who had violated the law, Yardley hadn't violated existing law because none had been passed. He was in the clear as far as publishing his book was concerned. Now, there is speculation that Yardley published his book to prove just how valuable signal intelligence was to the United States. Then there's the reason Yardley gave a friend of his. The February 4th, 2025 online Smithsonian magazine stated, quote, Yardley reportedly told a friend that his financial situation had left him no choice, though he felt the government's lousy treatment of him had made the decision easier. By closing his bureau, Yardley insisted, rather disingenuously, that the government had left the code-breaking business, so the secrets he had to offer were now harmless. Now, in the very same article, David Kahn was quoted from his book, quote, he exaggerated his successes in his official reports, though he was honest in minor personal matters, yet he told stories well. People liked them, close quote. Now, I don't think we'll ever know the whole reason Yardley spilled the beans on America's code-breaking ability. Yardley did write a second book titled Japanese Diplomatic Codes, 1921 to 1922. Now, unfortunately for Yardley, the U.S. Marshals seized that manuscript. It would not be until 1979 the manuscript was declassified. Yardley faded into obscurity after The Black Chamber was published. He did manage to do some work for the Chinese and the Canadian governments during World War II. However, pressure from the U.S. government basically sidelined any work Yardley could do for the Allies. In 1957, Yardley was able to turn one of his favorite pastimes into a book. He wrote Education of a Poker Player, which combined poker stories with math behind the poker strategies. It sold pretty good, but not as well as The Black Chamber. On August 7th, 1959, at the age of 69 years old, Herbert Yardley died in Washington, D.C., nearly a week after having a major stroke. Now, ironically though, Yardley was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in 1988 and the NSA Hall of Fame in 1990. So, what's the real story here? Who knows? We're dealing with signals intelligence, spies, code breaking. What's true, what isn't? You never know. Well, anyways, I hope you liked this video. Hey, if you did, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and most importantly, if you can leave a comment below, that would be fantastic. The algorithm sees that, and that pushes my video out to a wider audience, which in turn means more subscribers for my channel. Thank you for watching.